December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow fell in silence across the broken landscape of eastern Belgium, a cold so absolute it seemed to erase sound itself. Beneath the frozen canopy, thousands of German prisoners shuffled westward in columns, their field-gray uniforms caked with mud and ice, their eyes hollow from weeks of fighting in what their commanders had promised would be the final, decisive blow against the Western Allies. They had been told they were supermen, warriors of the Third Reich reclaiming destiny from the jaws of defeat. Now they walked as ghosts, their breath rising in thin clouds, their hands bound not by rope but by exhaustion, by the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. Among them, a young lancer named Klaus Richter felt the weight of his own boots, American issued after his own had disintegrated in the thaw and freeze of the winter campaign. He had not spoken in 3 days. There was nothing left to say. The Battle of the Bulge had shattered more than military lines. It had shattered the carefully constructed mythology that had sustained the Wehrmacht through 5 years of total war. These men, conscripted from farms and factories, indoctrinated in the invincibility of German arms and the weakness of democratic societies, had crashed against the reality of American industrial might and discovered themselves not supermen but mortals, exhausted and defeated. As they marched through the Ardennes toward processing camps in France and eventually across the Atlantic, they carried with them the fragments of an ideology that had consumed a generation. They expected brutality. They expected revenge. They had been told by Goebbels' propaganda machine that American soldiers were degenerates, that their nation was weak, divided by race and class, incapable of sustaining moral purpose. They expected to be treated as they had treated others, with the cold efficiency of a system that measured human worth in utility and race. What they did not expect was a church service. By January 1945, over 200,000 German prisoners of war had been transported to camps across the continental United States, part of a massive logistical operation that saw captured enemy combatants shipped to compounds stretching from the pine forests of Georgia to the wheat fields of Kansas. The Geneva Conventions dictated their treatment, but the American interpretation of those rules revealed something deeper than legal compliance. It revealed a fundamental assumption about human dignity that stood in stark opposition to the philosophy these men had served. The camps themselves were Spartan but adequate, rows of tar paper barracks surrounded by wire, watchtowers manned by guards too old or too young for frontline service. The prisoners received the same rations as American troops, ate from the same kitchens, slept on cots with mattresses and blankets. For men who had spent months eating frozen bread and watery soup in the ruins of the fatherland, this alone was incomprehensible. But it was not the food that broke them. It was the invitation. Camp Concordia, Kansas. January 17, 1945. A Sunday morning so cold the prairie wind cut through wool like wire. In Barracks 14, Klaus Richter woke to the sound of an American chaplain's assistant walking the camp, ringing a small brass bell. The sound was gentle, almost apologetic, and it carried through the thin walls with a clarity that seemed out of place in a prison. "Church service in 1 hour," the assistant called in broken German, his accent thick but earnest. "All faiths welcome. Voluntary attendance." Richter rolled onto his side, staring at the rough plank wall. He had not prayed since childhood, since before the Hitler Youth had taught him that the Führer was the only providence that mattered. Around him, other prisoners stirred, murmuring in the darkness. Some laughed bitterly. Church! As if they were free men. As if they had souls worth saving. But curiosity is a powerful force, especially among men who have been stripped of purpose. By the time the bell rang again, over 300 prisoners had assembled in the camp's makeshift chapel, a converted mess hall with wooden benches and a simple wooden cross mounted on the wall. The cross was unadorned, no corpus, no decoration, just 2 pieces of pine nailed together and stained dark. Richter sat near the back, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood. Around him, Men whispered in low voices, uncomfortable, suspicious. What was this? A propaganda exercise? A psychological trap? They had been taught to see deceit in every gesture of kindness, to interpret generosity as weakness or manipulation. The chaplain entered quietly, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the insignia of a captain on his uniform. His name was Father Joseph Brennan, a Catholic priest from Philadelphia who had volunteered for the chaplain corps in 1942. He carried no weapon, no book except a worn Bible, and when he stood before the assembled prisoners, he did not speak immediately. He simply looked at them, his gaze moving slowly across the rows of gaunt faces, and in that moment something shifted. These were not monsters. They were boys, barely older than his own nephews, hollowed out by a war they had not chosen and an ideology they had not fully understood. He had seen their letters, intercepted and read by censors, letters to mothers and wives filled not with fanaticism but with longing, with confusion, with the quiet desperation of men who had lost their way. Father Brennan began to speak in German, haltingly at first, reading from notes prepared with the help of a translator. "You are far from home," he said. "You are prisoners, yes, but you are also children of God. That has not changed. That will never change." His voice was soft, without judgment, and it carried through the hall like water through a cracked vessel, seeping into spaces long sealed shut. He spoke of the prodigal son, of a father who waited with open arms for a child who had wandered into darkness. He spoke of mercy, of redemption, of the possibility that even in the deepest despair there remained a path back to light. And then he did something extraordinary. He invited them to sing. The hymn was Ein fest Burg ist unser Gott, Martin Luther's great anthem, a song woven into the fabric of German Protestant identity for 4 centuries. A mighty fortress is our God. The prisoners knew it by heart, had sung it in their village churches before the war, before the party had tried to replace sacred ritual with torchlight parades and loyalty oaths. Father Brennan raised his hand, and the small pump organ in the corner wheezed to life, played by a young private who had learned the melody from a German hymnal. The first notes trembled in the air, tentative, fragile. And then, slowly, voices joined. A few at first, then dozens, then hundreds. The sound swelled, filling the converted mess hall, spilling out through the cracks in the walls into the frozen Kansas morning. Klaus Richter felt his throat tighten. The words came unbidden, muscle memory from childhood, from a time before the uniforms and the marches and the promises of glory. Ein fest Burg ist unser Gott, ein Gut where und Waffen. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. The melody wrapped around him, and for the first time in years, he remembered what it felt like to be something other than a soldier. He remembered his mother's voice, singing the same hymn in their small Lutheran church in Saxony, her hand warm in his as they stood together in the pew. He remembered the smell of candles and old wood, the way sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the floor in colors that seemed impossibly bright. And then the tears came, hot and sudden, spilling down his cheeks before he could stop them. He was not alone. All around him, men wept openly, their voices breaking on the ancient words, their shoulders shaking with sobs they had held back for years. These were men who had been taught that tears were weakness, that sentiment was a flaw to be purged in the fires of total war. They had watched friends die in the mud of Russia, had burned villages and followed orders that carved scars into their souls, had swallowed their horror and their grief because the system demanded it, because to feel was to falter. But here, in this wooden hall in the middle of Kansas, surrounded by their enemies, they were given permission to be human again. The chaplain did not command them to stop. He did not mock them or turn away. He simply stood at the front of the chapel, his own eyes wet, and let them sing and weep and remember. The service lasted less than an hour, but its impact rippled through the camp like a stone dropped into still water. In the days that followed, attendance at the voluntary services grew. Protestant, Catholic, even the smaller gatherings for Jewish prisoners who had been hidden among the Wehrmacht ranks, men who had concealed their identity to survive in an army that would have murdered them otherwise. The American chaplains made no distinctions, offered no hierarchy of worthiness. They treated each prisoner as a soul in need of care, a radical act in a world that had spent 6 years sorting humanity into categories of value and disposability. For men like Klaus Richter, this was more disorienting than the defeat itself. They had been told that democracy was chaos, that equality was a lie masking Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, that America was a mongrel nation without culture or discipline. Yet here they were, fed and clothed and offered spiritual comfort by the very people they had been sent to destroy. The cognitive dissonance was profound. In the barracks at night, prisoners argued in heated whispers. Some clung to the old narratives, insisting this was a trick, that the Americans were softening them for exploitation or worse. Others, like Richter, began to question everything they had been taught. If the enemy could show mercy, what did that say about the cause they had served? If these democratic degenerates could treat prisoners with dignity, what did that reveal about the system that had demanded obedience unto death? The questions gnawed at them, eroding the foundations of belief that had sustained them through the worst years of the war. And in that erosion, something new began to grow. The church services became a focal point, a space where the rupture between propaganda and reality could be examined, however tentatively. Father Brennan and his fellow chaplains understood this intuitively. They were not naive. They knew that many of these men had participated in atrocities, had enabled a regime of unparalleled evil. But they also believed in the possibility of transformation, in the long, difficult work of rebuilding a moral framework shattered by totalitarianism. They preached not politics but principles, not nationalism but universal human worth. They spoke of the dignity inherent in every person, of the commandment to love one's neighbor, of the responsibility to choose goodness even when the world demanded cruelty. And they did so not with the triumphalism of victors, but with the quiet humility of servants. This approach was deliberate, rooted in a broader American strategy toward German POWs that sought not merely to contain but to re-educate. The War Department had studied the psychology of the Nazi indoctrination, had interviewed defectors and analyzed propaganda, and had concluded that deprogramming required more than lectures. It required experience, the lived contradiction between what prisoners had been told and what they encountered. So the camps were designed to function as demonstrations of democratic principles in action. Prisoners formed their own internal governments, elected representatives to negotiate with camp authorities, managed their own recreational activities and educational programs. They published newspapers, staged theatrical productions, organized sports leagues. They were paid for labor in accordance with Geneva Convention standards, given access to libraries stocked with books banned in the Third Reich, encouraged to engage with ideas they had been taught to fear. And slowly, incrementally, many of them changed. Klaus Richter became a regular at the Sunday services. He did not find sudden faith, did not experience a blinding conversion, but he found something equally valuable, a community of men grappling with the same questions, the same guilt, the same tentative hope. He spoke with Father Brennan after services, halting conversations in broken German about the nature of sin, about the possibility of forgiveness, about how a man could live with what he had done and seen. The chaplain did not offer easy answers. He listened, and he asked questions, and he treated Richter not as an enemy but as a person struggling to find his way back from darkness. In those conversations, Richter began to see the outlines of a different worldview, one in which human worth was not contingent on race or ideology, in which redemption was always possible, in which mercy was not weakness but the highest expression of strength. The symbolic power of the church service, the hymn, the cross, the simple act of gathering in voluntary worship, became a thread that connected individual transformation to collective reckoning. The cross itself, unadorned and plain, stood in stark contrast to the elaborate iconography of the Third Reich, the eagles and swastikas and runes that had decorated every uniform and banner. It represented something older, simpler, more enduring than any political movement. It was a reminder that before the Führer, before the party, before the uniforms and the oaths, there had been other loyalties, other truths. And for many prisoners, that reminder cracked open a space for reflection that the relentless machinery of the Nazi state had tried to seal shut. By the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe ground toward its conclusion, the camps in America held over 370,000 German prisoners. They worked on farms, helped bring in harvests, repaired roads, and lived in conditions that were, by any measure, humane. They received news of the Reich's collapse, of the liberation of the concentration camps, of the full scope of the Holocaust. The revelations were met with disbelief, denial, horror. Some refused to accept the evidence, clinging to the claim that the reports were Allied propaganda. Others, confronted with photographs and testimonies, retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to reconcile what they had served with what had been done in their name. But a significant number, particularly those who had engaged with the re-education programs and the chaplaincy services, began the painful process of reckoning. Klaus Richter was among them. In July 1945, a documentary film compiled from footage shot at Bergen-Belsen and Dachau was shown in the camp theater. Attendance was mandatory, part of the War Department's denazification curriculum. Richter sat in the darkened hall and watched the skeletal figures, the mountains of corpses, the gas chambers disguised as showers. He watched German officers in crisp uniforms standing beside open pits filled with the dead. And he wept again, not the cathartic tears of the hymn but the wrenching sobs of a man confronting his complicity. He had not been in the camps, had not fired the guns or turned the valves, but he had worn the uniform, had fought for the system that made it all possible. That night he wrote a letter to his mother, a letter that would never be sent because she had died in the firebombing of Dresden. In it, he confessed his shame, his confusion, his desperate need to believe that there was a way forward, that the rest of his life could be something other than an attempt to forget. The church services continued, and they took on new dimensions. Father Brennan began to incorporate readings from the Nuremberg trial transcripts, from the testimonies of survivors, from the writings of German resistance figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian executed by the Nazis for his role in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He challenged the prisoners to confront the distance between the Christian teachings they claimed to honor and the actions they had enabled or ignored. He did not preach collective guilt, did not demand self-flagellation, but he insisted on collective responsibility. "You cannot undo what was done," he told them. "But you can choose what you will build in the ruins." For many prisoners, this message became a lifeline. It offered neither absolution nor condemnation but a path through the wreckage, a framework for understanding their experience and their future. They began to write essays, to debate in study groups, to imagine what Germany might become after the occupation. Some embraced the language of democracy with the zeal of converts, seeing in American principles the antidote to the poison that had consumed their homeland. Others remained skeptical, doubting that imported ideals could take root in soil so thoroughly poisoned. But almost all of them recognized that something fundamental had shifted. The world they had known was gone, and the world they would return to would demand different answers to the questions of loyalty, duty, and honor. The repatriation began in 1946, a slow trickle that would continue for years. Klaus Richter boarded a transport ship in New York Harbor in October of that year, part of a group of prisoners deemed sufficiently denazified to return home. He carried with him a small wooden cross, carved from a scrap of pine by a fellow prisoner during the long Kansas winter, a gift exchanged in the barracks the night before departure. He stood on the deck as the Statue of Liberty receded into the mist, and he thought about the hymn, about the tears, about Father Brennan's quiet insistence that redemption was real. He did not know what awaited him in Germany. did not know if he would find his family, if he would find work, if he would find a way to live with the weight of what had been. But he knew one thing with certainty. He was not the same man who had stumbled through the frozen Ardennes 14 months before. The story of German prisoners weeping in American church services is not widely told, but it is meticulously documented. Army chaplain reports, prisoner diaries, Red Cross inspection records, and post-war interviews all confirm the phenomenon. In camps across the United States, from Texas to Michigan, from California to New York, the same pattern repeated: initial suspicion, tentative participation, emotional release, and slow transformation. The voluntary attendance at religious services became one of the most reliable indicators of a prisoner's progress through the re-education process, a marker not of forced conversion but of willingness to engage with ideas and emotions that the totalitarian system had suppressed. The symbolic resonance of the hymn Ein Fest Burg cannot be overstated. Written by Martin Luther in 1529 during the existential crisis of the Reformation, the hymn had become a spiritual anthem of German-speaking Protestantism, sung in times of struggle and doubt. For prisoners to hear it played by their captors, to sing it in a language their enemies had learned in order to offer comfort, was to experience a moment of profound dissonance. It collapsed the binary of us and them, friend and enemy, victor and vanquished. It suggested that there were loyalties deeper than nationalism, truths older than ideology, and that these truths could be recognized across the lines of war. The cross, present in every chapel, reinforced this message. It was not an American cross or a German cross but a universal symbol, pointing beyond the immediate conflict to questions of meaning that no army could settle. Father Brennan and his fellow chaplains were acutely aware of the stakes. They had seen what totalitarianism did to the human spirit, how it reduced persons to functions, how it replaced conscience with obedience, how it weaponized loyalty and turned virtue into a tool of destruction. They understood that defeating Nazism militarily was necessary but insufficient. The ideas had to be defeated as well, not by suppression but by offering a superior alternative, by demonstrating through practice that democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, rested on a foundation of human dignity that no authoritarian system could match. The church services were a small part of this larger project, but they were crucial. They reached prisoners at a level that lectures and films could not, touched the emotional and spiritual dimensions of identity that propaganda had exploited so effectively. The results were imperfect, uneven, contested. Not every prisoner experienced transformation. Some returned to Germany embittered, convinced that their suffering had been in vain, susceptible to the revanchist narratives that would emerge in the post-war period. Others became ardent Democrats, key figures in the reconstruction of West Germany, bringing with them the lessons learned in American captivity. Still others occupied a more ambiguous space, neither fully rejecting the past nor fully embracing the future, carrying the contradictions within themselves for the rest of their lives. But the aggregate effect was significant. By the time the last German POW left American soil in 1948, tens of thousands had been exposed to a model of society fundamentally different from the one they had served. They had seen abundance without cruelty, strength without brutality, order without oppression. And for many, that experience planted seeds that would bear fruit in the decades to come. Klaus Richter returned to Saxony, to a city reduced to rubble and a nation divided by ideology. He found work as a schoolteacher, rebuilt his life in the shadow of Soviet occupation, and eventually fled to the West during the Berlin airlift. He settled in Stuttgart, married, raised 2 children, and never spoke publicly about his time in Kansas. But he kept the wooden cross on his desk, and on Sunday mornings he attended a small Lutheran church where they sang Ein Fest Burg with the same fervor he remembered from his childhood. His daughter would later recall that he wept every time, without fail, though he never explained why. Only after his death in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the archives began to open, did the family discover the letters he had written but never sent, the diaries he had kept during his captivity, the careful record of a man trying to understand how he had lost his way and how, against all odds, he had found it again. The American chaplains who served in the POW camps returned to civilian life as well, carrying with them the memory of those services, the sound of hundreds of voices raised in a language they barely understood, singing a hymn of faith and struggle. Father Brennan went back to Philadelphia, resumed his parish work, and rarely spoke of his wartime service. But in 1962, during a sermon on forgiveness, he told the story of a Sunday morning in Kansas, of young men far from home, broken by war and ideology, who wept when they were allowed to sing. He told his congregation that in that moment he had witnessed the possibility of grace, the stubborn resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for transformation even in the darkest circumstances. And he said that it had taught him more about the nature of God than any theological text, more about the meaning of mercy than any doctrinal formula. The legacy of the POW church services extends beyond individual stories. It became part of the broader narrative of American post-war policy, evidence that the United States, for all its contradictions and failures, attempted to wage not merely a military campaign but a moral one. The treatment of German prisoners stood in stark contrast to the treatment they would have received in Soviet camps, where mortality rates were staggering, where forced labor was brutal, where the very idea of spiritual care was dismissed as bourgeois superstition. It demonstrated that democracy, rooted in Enlightenment principles and Judeo-Christian ethics, could generate institutions and practices that honored human dignity even in the context of total war. This was not propaganda. It was policy, enacted daily by thousands of chaplains, guards, administrators, and ordinary Americans who took seriously the proposition that even enemies possessed inalienable rights. The cross, the hymn, the tears, these became symbols of a larger truth that the 20th century had tried desperately to obscure. Totalitarianism, whether fascist or communist, rested on the claim that human beings were malleable material, that identity could be engineered, that loyalty could be commanded and enforced through a combination of indoctrination and terror. The church services in the POW camps offered a quiet refutation. They suggested that there were dimensions of human experience that no state could fully control, that conscience could be suppressed but not destroyed, that the longing for meaning and connection persisted even in the most hostile environments. When German prisoners sang Ein Fest Berg and wept, they were not merely mourning their defeat or their displacement. They were mourning the years stolen from them, the innocence corrupted, the lies they had believed and the truths they had ignored. And in that mourning, they were reclaiming something essential, some core of selfhood that the system had tried to erase. This is the deeper story of the church services, the one that transcends the immediate historical moment. It is a story about the contest between worldviews, about the struggle to define what it means to be human in an age of mechanized violence and ideological extremism. The Nazis had offered one answer. Humanity is a hierarchy, worth is determined by blood and power, and the strong have the right to dominate and destroy the weak. The Americans, imperfectly and inconsistently, offered another. Humanity is a common condition, worth is inherent and equal, and strength is measured not by the ability to inflict suffering but by the capacity to extend mercy. The church services embodied this alternative, translated abstract principles into lived experience, and in doing so provided prisoners with a framework for rebuilding their understanding of themselves and the world. The impact rippled outward, touching not only the prisoners but also the Americans who interacted with them. Chaplains, guards, camp administrators, and local civilians who employed POW labor all encountered the human face of the enemy, complicated the easy narratives of good and evil, and grappled with the ethical complexities of occupation and reconstruction. Many came away from the experience with a deeper appreciation for the fragility of democracy, for the constant work required to sustain institutions grounded in justice and compassion, for the ease with which fear and resentment could be weaponized against those principles. The church services reminded them that the war was not only against a military force but against a way of thinking, and that winning the peace required vigilance, humility, and a commitment to ideals that were always aspirational, never fully realized. In the decades that followed, as the Cold War hardened divisions and memories of the Second World War became mythologized. The story of the POW camps faded from popular consciousness. It did not fit neatly into triumphalist narratives, did not provide clear moral lessons, did not offer the satisfying closure of villains punished and heroes celebrated. But for those who lived it, for men like Klaus Richter and Father Brennan, it remained a defining experience, a moment when the carefully constructed boundaries of identity and ideology dissolved, revealing something more fundamental, more true. They carried that moment with them, a quiet knowledge that even in the heart of darkness, even among enemies, it was possible to recognize a shared humanity and to act accordingly. The wooden cross, passed from prisoner to prisoner, carried back to Germany and preserved in homes and attics across the rebuilt nation, became a silent witness to this possibility. It was not an artifact of conquest or submission, but a token of connection, a reminder that mercy had been offered and received, that transformation had occurred, that the long road back from totalitarianism began not with grand political gestures but with small acts of recognition and care. And the hymn, Ein Fest Berg, continued to be sung in churches on both sides of the Atlantic, its ancient words resonating across time and conflict, testifying to the endurance of faith, the resilience of hope, and the stubborn insistence of the human spirit that love, however battered and scarred, could survive even the worst that history could inflict. This is what the German soldiers discovered when they cried hearing their first American church service. They discovered that the enemy they had been taught to despise was capable of grace, that the ideology they had served was a lie, and that the path back to wholeness, though long and painful, was still open. They discovered that freedom was not chaos, that equality was not weakness, that mercy was not sentimentality but the foundation of a moral order they had been denied. And they discovered that in the ruins of their certainty, in the collapse of everything they had believed, there remained the possibility of beginning again, of building something better from the fragments. That discovery, born in a converted mess hall in Kansas on a frozen Sunday morning, echoed through the lives of tens of thousands of men, shaping the post-war world in ways both subtle and profound. It stands as a testament to the power of institutions rooted in human dignity, to the transformative potential of empathy enacted across the lines of conflict, and to the enduring truth that even the most broken souls can find their way home when offered the hand of mercy instead of the fist of vengeance.